The House Intelligence Committee is continuing its probe of the agency's manipulation of American and foreign journalism. But over the past few years, the CIA has been on public trial on many other charges: dirty tricks, attempted assassinations, the overthrow of foreign governments. The response has been a major effort, at least in public, to clear house and refurbish the spy agency's image. Recently, Admiral Stansfield Turner, the CIA director appointed by President Carter, has been handing out mass dismissals. Tonight, with 4 former CIA officials, we examine what's happening inside the CIA and what effect it may have on the agency's effectiveness. Jim?
Robin, most good spy stories are about spies being fired at. This one is about spies just being fired. 200 of them since October by CIA boss Turner, another 600 to go by March, and maybe 200 more shortly thereafter. It's thrown the CIA into great internal turmoil that gets rougher and more public with each new round of termination notices. The target for the roughest goings-over has been Turner himself. But underlying the intramural fight is the question of the CIA's role and direction, because most of the terminated officers have come from the clandestine or secret side of the CIA's operations. First, let's get the perspective of a man who once held Turner's job, William Colby. Mr. Colby was CIA director from 1973 to 76. He was with the agency for 26 years in all, before that with the OSS. He's now an attorney here in Washington and just finished a book about his CIA career. Mr. Colby, are these cuts in force justified in your opinion?
Well, I believe so, yes. Actually, the size of the agency has been reduced each of the last approximately 10 years because of the change in the agency's mission. During the 50s and 60s, the agency spent almost half of its budget on political and paramilitary operations. Today, it spends, I think, less than 2% on that kind of operation. Obviously, you don't need as many people to do that, and so consequently, there has been a gradual reduction over a number of years of the size of CIA with that in mind, with the fact that its mission has changed. Some things have become more important, like technology, scholarship. Some things become less important, like political and paramilitary operations.
Do you think the emphasis then on the clandestine operations for these cuts fits what you just said, right?
Yes,
just
I think
normal,
so.
Natural thing?
Although the clandestine operation still includes the clandestine collection of information, and that job is still there to be done, and a very important one.
Well, your predecessor, your successor, Admiral Turner, has been criticized for the way he handled these cuts. What's your feeling about that?
Well, I gather that the agency, and even Admiral Turner, I think, has said something about that left a lot to be desired, that the rather cold passing out of slips. In other words, I think most people agreed with the need to reduce, but I think the great shock was the way it was handled, and I hope that now that they've had this experience, that the remaining reductions will be somewhat more delicately handled.
Well, now, you were planning similar cuts when you were the man in charge, but you were going to do them over, I think, a longer period of time. Were you not? Over 5 years, and then, but the Admiral Turner has escalated it or contracted that to 2 years. Why was that done, do you know? Do you know?
Well, I don't know why he did it. Obviously, he thought that the size of the force was too big for the job that needed to be done today. I don't know why. I haven't discussed this with him, and I don't know what his rationale is on that.
What do you think the impact of all of this has been inside the CIA in terms of morale, in terms of effectiveness, and that sort of thing?
Well, CIA has had 2 previous experiences like this, in the early 60s and in 1973, when a number of people were reduced and let go. Each time there was quite a lot of turbulence, quite a lot of concern, and each time the agency survived, picked itself up, went back to work. I think that's what's going to happen here. It is hard on the individuals, there's no question about it. And sometimes it's hard for them to get a new job also. But nonetheless, I think the efficiency of the agency has been established, and it's a going part of the American government and will continue.
Do you not feel, though, that this time it has been much more public than it ever has been before? I mean, with these stories that we read in the Washington papers, attacks on Turner personally and all this kind of thing, that's never happened before.
Well, it happened a little bit in 73, that kind of thing, yes. It's more turbulent now, yes, but I think CIA has to be more public than it used to be. I think that's one of the major changes. that perhaps we were too secret in the old days. I think that the revelations, the shock effect of some of the revelations has come from that high degree of secrecy that characterized the past. It characterized the past with the full support of everybody concerned, the public, the President, the Congress, I might add. This was not CIA's doing. But today we have to learn to run a more public and publicly responsible agency, but still keep secret the few secrets that need to be kept, i.e. the names of the sources, just like you journalists.
All right. Thank you. Robin?
Is the old-fashioned spy no longer necessary in today's world of satellites and electronic gadgetry? A former agency official who opts for the analytical and technical approach is Herbert Scoville. Dr. Scoville spent his CIA tenure in the Science and Technology Division, first as its assistant director and then as deputy director for research. Dr. Scoville, do you agree with the purpose of these cuts to de-emphasize traditional notions of spying in favor of technology and analysis?
Well, I certainly do believe that the major source of our intelligence today, it does come from technical resources, and that the clandestine collection of intelligence through agents is no longer as important as it used to be. On the other hand, I'm not prepared to say that one should cancel all clandestine collection of intelligence. But there is, of course, also another part of the agency's activities, what was known as covert action, which wasn't for the collection of information, but was to influence governments and political activities in other countries. That has been greatly de-emphasized, and in my view, very properly so, because I don't believe that kind of activity has any place for the government of the United States.
So James Bond's career isn't quite dead, but dying, is it?
Yes, well, of course, even James Bond had quite a few gadgets, so he always relied on science as well. But science has really done amazing things when you think what has been accomplished in the last 15 to 20 years in terms of the technological methods of collecting intelligence.
Could I, since I don't think many of us are really aware of the range of that, could you briefly sketch in what is in the public domain that you could that we do use that has so brought about this revolution?
Well, the primary additional source, or relatively new source, has been the use of observation satellites for the collection of intelligence. It is now possible to get photographic observation of the entire Soviet Union in a single day. This is far superior to what President Eisenhower was seeking in 1955 when he was calling for an open skies proposal in which the Soviet Union would allow airplanes to go over the Soviet Union and look at specific targets. Now, every single day, satellites can photograph the Soviet Union from one end to the other.
Down to what degree of detail?
Well, to a high degree of detail. I can't tell you precisely whether it's to the inch or to the foot or the 5 feet, but nevertheless to the point where we can detect all manner of military activities. In fact, in the SALT agreements, it has been agreed that we can monitor the size of a missile to within 10 to 15%, which means that our capabilities must be certainly down in the order of a foot or two.
Mr. Colby just said that some information still has to be gathered by individuals in the traditional way. How much, do you think?
Well, I think very little, actually. Certainly that is true when it comes to the Soviet Union, which is, of course, the major security threat to the United States. Human intelligence sources have, over the years, provided less and less information of any real value. In terms of political information, and particularly in areas around the world, in less developed areas, why then agent type of information can be of greater use. But on the whole, it is, in my view, a vanishing asset, but I'm not prepared to say it should be abandoned altogether.
Do you believe at all that all these changes and dismissals recently have been handled in such a maladroit manner that they will make it more difficult for the CIA in the immediate future to carry on its job for morale reasons?
Well, I, of course, only know what I've read in the press as far as this is concerned, but my impression is that it was a little heavy-handed. Now, the dismissals have occurred in the areas which I don't believe are essential to what I think is CIA's important function, and that is in the analysis and collection of information, particularly technical information. So these firings won't affect those directly. Nevertheless, the agency as a whole probably has a morale problem as far as this is concerned. This morale problem, of course, existed before the firings as a result of all the disclosures which have occurred over the last 5 years or so.
Thank you. Jim?
All right, someone who thinks the CIA could be trimmed even more is Harry Rositsky. Mr. Rositsky is a 27-year CIA veteran who specialized in Soviet operations with assignments in Munich, New Delhi, and here in Washington. What is your feeling about these, initially, about these cutbacks, Mr. Rositsky?
Well, I think, as Bill Colby said, we started cutting back, really, in the 60s, and we should have cut back rapidly enough so there wouldn't have been any requirement to have such wholesale firings. I have had the feeling during my entire career there that after Korea, with the buildup both in the Pentagon and in CIA and in State, that we were getting to be a very overstaffed bureaucracy, particularly in Washington. There are limits on the number of operators that can go undercover, private or official, overseas. But even after Mr. Nixon's cuts, and then more recently after the CIA people came back from Vietnam, most of those people were harbored in Langley. Less people overseas, more people here to support them. So I'm highly in favor of continuing substantial cuts, but I think they should be done in a perhaps slightly less rapid fashion. Whether a couple of years go by before they're down to where they should be or whether it takes a year, I think is secondary to the fact that a lot of very good guys are taking short shrift before they're eligible for their retirement, who've given 20 years, let us say, of intense devotion to what very often is a rather difficult and demanding career.
What do you think, where do you think it should eventually end? In other words, where do you think the CIA of tomorrow should be in terms of size? Is it too big? You say it's too big. How
Well,
big should it be?
It's a tough one because the Operations Directorate is still a very large one. And
Well, that's the operations directorate. That's clandestine.
That's carrying out
Right.
secret intelligence, counterintelligence operations, and political action when authorized by the president. Now, actually, that whole job could be done by a very limited number of people, depending upon the targets given to the secret intelligence outfit. Let's say are human agents necessary? Well, they're necessary if the tasks that are given by the White House, the State Department, and the Pentagon demand coverage that the technicians can't do. Now, I was impressed by the fact when I was in Delhi, we had a couple of communist sources. They had friends who traveled to Moscow. They traveled to Peking. We were able to alert Washington 2 years before there was any real sign of the Sino-Soviet split that it was occurring and it was on the border issue. Well, right now, one of the crucial issues in front of us, I think, in our political strategy is, will Moscow and Peking get together again? Now, a few sources in Moscow or Peking who could give us a year, 2 years warning, look, they're patching up and here are the conditions and there will or will not be military assistance from one to the other. This could be worth millions, just a few reports, to the White House.
And one of Mr. Scoville's satellites couldn't get that information.
Mr. Scoville's satellites unfortunately cannot enter into the mind of men, Russian or capitalist, and that is where some of the crucial decisions are made that will determine our future policies. So that to that extent, if we talk about intentions, no satellite can ever say what either President Carter or Mr. Brezhnev are going to do tomorrow or next year, but it might come out of a committee meeting somewhere in Washington or Moscow. For CIA to have a man in that meeting, as we had Penkovsky in the old days, and forgetting about the scientific coverage of military, that I think there's no question about. They can give us early warning. They can count missiles. But let's leave that as the umbrella. What happens in this workaday world, day in, day out, when all sorts of nations are up to doing all sorts of things, some of which we would like to know in advance? Only a human being in the right spot can give us that information.
Thank you. Robin?
As founder of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers, David Phillips helps promote public understanding of the role of intelligence. After 25 years of service, Mr. Phillips retired from the CIA, where he'd been the chief of Latin American operations. He's now the author of 2 books on the CIA. Mr. Phillips, is the present management really downplaying human spies in favor of electronic gadgets, or is this just the surface?
I think probably they are downplaying it, and I think it's understandable. The present perception in our country is that technological spying somehow is clean and it's all right. It usually is just as illegal as James Bond going through a window. But I think there's probably an inclination. I think I remember seeing Admiral Turner on national television 3 or 4 months ago, and he was asked to describe one of the past feats of intelligence. And he chose the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which was a very good example. And he stated that during that time, U-2s were able to fly over Cuba and take photographs, and interpreters were able to tell the president what those missile systems were. What he did not mention, and what I think is very important, is that it was a spy who told us that the U-2 should fly over and take a look. And the reason the interpreters could give the president such a precise condition of that missile system is that another spy, Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, had passed over the manuals to Western intelligence. So yes, I think it's being downplayed, and I understand why.
But spies are not passé. Human spies are not passé in your view.
I don't think they're ever going to be passé until you can say that in intelligence overseas, you can do without understanding human behavior. And even more important in the spy business is understanding human irrationality. Because we talk about the times when there's been a great failure in the intelligence system or that sort of thing. Usually if you look back, you'll find that some act that seems almost irrational took place. And unfortunately, that's been happening throughout history.
What have the cutbacks, according to your information, done to morale in the agency?
Well, first of all, everyone working there has been through quite a meat grinder for the past 3 years. So they've been beset by problems from all sides. I think what it boils down to is this latest business. I don't think anyone really believes, that's known intelligence, that cuts shouldn't take place. While I have the opportunity, I would like to say that I think a good, healthy 20% cut of every government bureaucracy in Washington would be healthy for this country. But the manner, obviously, is the problem. Now, we read fiction about the honorable schoolboy, and Nathan Hale, the first American spy, said, whatever service is necessary is thereby honorable. Now, I don't think that spies have the right to go around and say that they have to be branded as honorable, but I do feel that they want to believe that they are necessary. When Bill Colby was the chief of the CIA, like other CIA chiefs, he had an almost unique thing that he could do. He could fire someone on the spot. That's the way it should be. If you have a maladroit spy, you should get rid of him. But if someone works in a dark alley for 18 or 20 years, I think that the end should be a little easier for him.
What do they do, these former spies, when they're thrust out in the cold? Do they have a marketable skill?
Well, it used to be that when people left the CIA, they didn't fade away. They walked to the nearest college campus because the people that have worked there generally have come from very fine schools. They have graduate degrees. The people who have been overseas might speak 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 languages. They know the world, and so they would go onto a college campus. Today, one of those men who goes to a college will lose out in the job to a man who has half of his capability because they don't want to spook around the premises.
So there's an employment problem.
There's a very definite employment problem, except in the security field, if you want to watch warehouses and that sort of thing.
And there's a certain glut in the market of spy novels?
There certainly is, yes. Too many people writing them.
Thank you. Jim?
Mr. Colby, does that concern you also, what these 800 or so former CIA agents are now going to do for employment because of the image of the CIA these last several years?
Very much so. I've been approached by one very patriotic American who said that he wanted to look at some of the resumes. He was enough of an old-fashioned fellow to think that these are good people, and he wanted to check them over and perhaps hire some. But I think other companies, and as Mr. Phillips says, the universities are somewhat concerned about CIA people.
Well, I read a story the other day which said that the CIA now was actually assisting, maybe Dave Phillips, you can tell me whether this is correct or not, actually assisting these agents who have been let go in writing resumes so they won't have to write a resume that does not say they worked at the CIA, because they're afraid that would be bad when they went in to apply for a job. Is that right?
Well, Jim, I'm not sure that that's the rationale behind it. Over the years, the custom has been for the people who have been involved in the covert side of CIA. They would have to have some sort of resume if they wanted a second career. And so one was fabricated for security reasons. One that didn't really say this fellow has been an intelligence officer all these years, but more or less gave the thrust of his capabilities. So I think this is probably just continuing that same tradition.
I see, I see. Well, look, let's go back to the question of technology versus the human element. Dr. Scoville, you heard what your three colleagues said, particularly Mr. Rositsky, and also what Mr. Phillips said, that the whole thing is now toward technological thing because it's clean, and he says it's just as bad as the human element. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think I don't agree with their point of view on the technology, on technological intelligence. In the first place, many methods of collecting technological intelligence are perfectly legal. For example, satellite observation is perfectly legal. The Soviet Union has signed the ABM Treaty, which specifically endorses that kind of intelligence collection. They don't say satellites, but they call it national technical means. This is in a treaty which the Soviet Union had agreed to. It's perfectly legal. It's quite different from the old days when the U-2 was shot down. Now the collection of intelligence by satellites is legal. And there are other means. There's a tendency to concentrate entirely on satellites. There are other means of technological intelligence. For example, detecting nuclear tests over the years has always been done by technical means at very remote distances, which are perfectly legal and which work extremely well, far better than any scientist and than any agent. And I guess I also would tend to disagree with my colleagues in they sort of downgraded the importance of technology in, say, such places as the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is true that there were some agents that were reporting missiles in Cuba at that time. I was personally very much involved in this thing. But there were, I think, the postmortem after the event showed that there had been 200 reports of Soviet missiles in Cuba, and only 6 of those were reliable. And all of the others were misconceptions on the part of the observers, mistaking an air defense missile, which we knew about, with an offensive missile. Right. It was the U-2 operation which really was useful in that particular case, and we carried it out regardless of whether there are any agents involved in it.
Mr. Colby, are we always going to need human spies?
Yes, we are. I think the point here is not an argument between these two methods. Dr. Scoville's absolutely right. We have pushed back the borders of ignorance to an incredible degree in the last 10 years or so, thanks to technology. Then we don't have to use spies to collect information about Soviet divisions and things like that. No, because we get them. But the role and importance of the political decision, economic decision-making, the fact that many other countries in the world consciously try to keep things secret from us is going to require that we develop people who can penetrate into those secrets, warn us of them, so that we can protect ourselves.
Let's be a little practical about these matters, which really the questions you asked needn't be very classified. The President of the United States would like to know certain things. He would like to know, for example, when the Japanese negotiating team comes over here, what authorization have they to do what? He'd like to know what the sum of some of the discussions...
You mean like tomorrow?
Or the next day, or the next day, or the next 10 years.
All right, all right.
What goes on when the Italian Communist Party leaders have a discussion with a visitor from Moscow, usually from the international section? How do they look at this business of Euro-communism? How do they feel about the French Communist Party breaking their compact with the socialists? What are their long-term intentions? I might even go farther. We're living in an economic world. To what extent are there now at work in Tokyo or in Bonn plans for production, investment, etc., involving or not involving capital investment in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union? Now, these aren't very exciting things. They have nothing to do with missiles, which really kind of stand there on both sides while all this is going on. These are questions that if the President wants to know the answers to, he can only get them through human agents.
And what, for instance, and another one, what are the plans of some terrorist group like the Baader Meinhof to transport some of their activities here to the United States?
All right, Robin?
Yes, gentlemen, finally, Mr. Carter and Vice President Mondale said a lot when they first took office about having a CIA that operated in a manner consistent with the ideals of the American public and American tradition. Can the American public have a CIA that is both effective and 99 and 44/100% pure, or is that a naive belief on their part and those politicians who believe it? Mr. Colby?
I think the CIA can produce intelligence through means acceptable to the American people and government. I think we need to have that written in a law as to what those rules are. One of the problems is that years ago we didn't have any rules, and we made them up as we went along, and on a few occasions we went over the edge of what we now think would have been proper. If we have the rules, if we have the Congress supervising the performance of the intelligence community, and I think no longer shutting their eyes, as one senator once referred to their role, then I think we will adhere to those rules. Now, that doesn't mean that you won't use some trickery to get into a secret that another country is trying to keep from our country. That's true, but I think we can follow rules.
Mr. Phillips, do you agree with that?
Well, was it Butch Cassidy who said there are no rules in a knife fight? People who work in intelligence must learn that there are some rules in their intelligence game. That's the way it's going to be in our country, and that's the way I think it should be. However, as much as it would be desired, I just don't believe that you can get out in those dark alleys and some of those dark jungles without keeping some of the trappings of traditional espionage, which happens to be illegal in every country in the world where it's practiced. So we have to find in our government, especially after Watergate and Vietnam, a form of intelligence operations which will be acceptable to the American people and even to the people who work in intelligence and face problems of personal ethics and so forth, and still not find a situation such as Pearl Harbor, where we were surprised and did incredible things such as put Japanese American citizens into concentration camps.
Thank you very much. Thank you all, gentlemen in Washington. Good night, Jim.
Good night, Robin.
Thank you, Mr. Phillips. That's all.